So throughout the various Star Wars movies and TV shows, we see a lot of people moving around the galaxy, but normally these people moving around the galaxy are smugglers or high-ranking government officials or members in a large military. But how did the everyday citizens of the galaxy move around? Well, I figured today we could dive into civilian transport in Star Wars and what it would look like for a citizen of the galaxy to move around this vast stretch of space. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, before I dive into this, I'd like to throw out there that, unlike many topics on this channel, I might have a little bit of first-hand experience here, because I actually did get a chance to experience the Star Cruiser while it was open, and that was about as close as you could step to being inside the Star Wars universe. And it was simulating a large civilian space transport, so I'm going to bank on that a little bit, but I'm also going to talk about more business-oriented travel as opposed to what is essentially big space cruise. So let's start with what we see on screen and leave Star Cruiser to the side for now. So we actually do see some of this on screen in Star Wars Rebels in particular, but occasionally popping up elsewhere, for transportation between sort of closer destinations. We see the Rebels use a civilian transport while transporting to Gorel fairly early on in the show's run, and it seems to function either like a public bus, or maybe one could compare it to booking a flight on current modern air travel. And within maybe, I'd say probably less than a few hours, you're at your destination. And this is perfect for transportation to and from, like I said, relatively close destinations that don't have a massive travel time. These vessels all tend to be pretty small, and maybe carry a few dozen passengers at best, but it also is worth noting that this vehicle seems to be dedicated to carrying passengers. But let's say you wanted to get from the outer rim of the galaxy all the way into the core, visiting worlds like Coruscant from your home planet on, let's say, like Tatooine or something. How exactly are you going to manage that? Well, that's where I think larger transports come in, and that's something we see a lot less of in Star Wars. We do see one kind of in Attack of the Clones, when Anakin and Padme flee Coruscant to escape the prevalent assassination attempts on Padme, and they're instructed to flee to Naboo, and they do so on what's essentially a cargo passenger liner. This is a bit more chaotic, and definitely a mixed-use vehicle designed to carry cargo and passengers, like I mentioned. And it seems like the passenger spaces on this ship are less akin to air travel in the current day, and more akin to something like a large ocean-going vessel, where their passengers are standing up and walking around and moving around these spaces on board. We see them visiting, for example, a large galley where they get food. This, to me, sounds like a migrant ship. It could be compared to, at the turn of the century, very old ocean liners that were primarily cargo and cheaper passenger fares. I would imagine for more higher cost tickets you could get on a much nicer vessel, but I think when we're talking about the travel times necessary for moving from the core out to the outer rim, or even to the mid-rim where Naboo was in that case, you're probably dealing with something larger than a public bus. It's also worth noting that when we're talking about distances like that, the vessels tend to get larger, and that's kind of an efficiency thing. Having a small vessel running back and forth between Coruscant and the Outer Rim is going to be disproportionately resource-intensive versus having a large vehicle that can carry a lot more cargo and passengers, and thus net a larger profit for the vehicle's operators. As such, you're going to see larger things like these cargo-passenger hybrids that are the size of small container ships, or even like large container ships in some cases, moving people and goods across the galaxy. And we're going to see for the lower price tickets that combination of passengers and cargo, because it just makes more sense. Now, that being said, I'm sure there are higher price tickets available on nicer vessels for those that can afford the luxury of traveling in style around the Star Wars galaxy, but at a certain point you just have your own ship, and all of this is irrelevant, so that's worth mentioning as well. Now, there's one more bit of civilian travel that I want to bring in, and that's where Star Cruiser comes in, and that's the non-destination-based civilian travel, the leisure cruises, if you will, that really serve more as a vacation than anything else. Those would be on dedicated passenger vessels like the Purgle-class transport that the Halcyon that we see in the Star Cruiser was. These vessels are laid out and function a lot like modern cruise ships, with staterooms and dining rooms and various public venues for the passengers to enjoy while they're on board, moving around the galaxy and stopping off at various destinations. Now, once again, I will throw a little caveat in there that this type of excursion is less based around getting from point A to point B, like a traditional transport, and more about the leisure of the adventure around the galaxy, but it is still technically a form of civilian transport, and I do think a lot of these features would have been present on some of the higher value civilian transports that would carry you from point A to point B, so it's worth mentioning that at a certain point it does start to become basically like a modern cruise ship. But where does all of this come into play within the greater story of Star Wars and the way it affects the major factions? Well, many of the military factions throughout galactic history had no use for civilian transport. They had their own transports and their own ways of getting around, and ultimately those were safer and more secure than civilian transport, with one notable exception, and that's the Rebel Alliance. The Rebel Alliance needed to rely on civilian infrastructure to move their soldiers and personnel around the galaxy, and that's just one of the many ways that Rebels moved around the Star Wars galaxy during the early days of the Rebel Alliance. If you'd like to learn more about the logistics of moving Rebel personnel and supplies around the galaxy, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think my assessment of civilian transport in Star Wars is correct. Do you think it really depends on the distance you're going, whether you're on something that's more like a public bus or something that's more like a cruise ship, or do you think they're all more or less like flights and we're really just seeing the highest in luxury when we see massive vessels like the Halcyon, for example? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.